Welcome to this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic, where today we're going to address this video circulating around Twitter that has been viewed millions of times in a week, showing an ascent from Earth to low Earth orbit using a space elevator platform. Here's the video in full, and we're going to break down what we see here to help answer the OP's question to Elon Musk, asking, why is this not possible? We watched the ascent from inside the capsule, presumably a cylindrical shape judging by the round tubes the capsule zips through at top speed, while hanging off one side of a channeled cable, as opposed to being weight distributed evenly on either side. Looking up through the skylight, we see the terminus quickly coming into view, with the cable entering the off-center station dock at the edge of the structure. Upon arrival, the airlock closes and allows passengers to debark into a space station. Before we dig in too deeply here, it's probably worth noting that the first concept for a space elevator, like so many space-related concepts that get dusted off every decade or so, goes back to Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. His concept, first published in 1895 for a freestanding tower, 36,000 kilometers high, was never worked out mathematically, but it's where the first published thought in this regard occurred, not counting the Tower of Babel. Over the years, this concept has been revisited many times and has made its way into our science fiction, but has not yet become science fact. Going back to the video, let's start breaking it down. For starters, the video doesn't show the ground station departure, so let's see if we can figure out where the terminal was positioned using clues in the video and comparing them to Google Earth. This is the view of Earth from the station residing presumably somewhere in L.E.O. L.E.O is broken down into three zones. Very low Earth orbit beginning at 160 to 450 kilometers altitude where the ISS resides, then lower L.E.O stretching out to 1200 kilometers, and upper L.E.O taking us out to 2000 kilometers. We're looking down at Earth from somewhere in one of those three zones. For people that don't recognize this spit of land, that's Florida, with the very distinct Lake Okeechobee featured prominently in this shot from this elevation. The elevator cable drops to a point somewhere north of there. If we back up the video a bit to find other landmarks, in this segment you can see another lake with a very unique shape, like a puzzle piece with a couple islands in it. Lake Kissimmee, and above it, Lake Tohokaliga. From here, the terminal is located northwest. Backing up the video even further, to where the capsule was closest to the ground, we want to find these two unique landmarks visible through the low-lying cloud cover. There's this road with a sweeping 90-degree turn, then another turn the other way, making it noteworthy, and this highway interchange to the west of the terminal. On Google Earth, here's that unique road, and here's the highway interchange. So the space elevator terminal in this video is located at Disney World, specifically near Epcot Center, which made us wonder if Disney was at all involved in this video without being credited, and turns out we could have saved ourselves some trouble by Googling Disney World Space Elevator, because, yes, this is part of a dining attraction at Disney World called Space 220, a restaurant that offers a virtual experience of riding up in a space elevator capsule to dine aboard Centauri Space Station located in L.E.O. before returning to Earth. TNG fans should feel right at home here. And the 220 in the name refers to the imagined altitude of the dining platform, 220 miles or about 350 kilometers above the Earth, a number that will be useful later. Now that we figured out where the video comes from, we looked for and found a better quality and full-length video of the experience from Mousesteps JWL Media. This better quality video shows the entire trip from the capsule leaving ground floor as it were, and zipping up the cable until it arrives at the station, giving us a complete time for the ride. And even though we know now this is a Disney dining attraction, we're still going to break it down for you as if it were any other space elevator CGI concept video out there, from companies purporting to be working on a similar project. Why not? We're here already, and an episode on space elevators is definitely overdue. Let's do it. For starters, as we determined, the simulation launches to L.E.O. from Florida. But since Epcot Center is not located anywhere near the equator at 28 degrees north, that location would never be considered. Most experts, and we're going to use that term very loosely for this episode, most experts agree that such a system would have to be located on the equator. Like, on the equator, not just in the neighborhood, to take maximum advantage of the rotation of the Earth at 1600 kilometers an hour at the equator. Any other position would not be aligned properly from the planet to fling Centauri Station straight out from the planet while connected by a tether, meaning the entire continental US and even Hawaii is out of the running. These countries would be the only suitable candidates for such a facility on land. Or some people might think the terminal could be located at sea, even in international waters. That's an even wackier concept, and we'll go through why shortly. Going back to the video, the entire trip from ground station to docking in L.E.O. takes under a minute, and the climber ascends at a remarkable speed. We wanted to figure out how fast it was moving, so here's what we came up with. Total trip takes a minute to get from the ground to the station in L.E.O. at 350 kilometers altitude. And yes, we're working with the parameters from the Disney ride, but you can plug in different numbers from whatever other vaporware organization is suggesting a similar concept to see what you come up with using their paradigm. So, 1 minute ride time to get 350 kilometers from the surface of the planet. 350 clicks in a minute works out to 21,000 kilometers per hour, Mach 17 if you're curious, and that's an average speed, since the climber has to accelerate at launch and decelerate before arrival, so the top speed would be even higher than that. That lift is going to require an insane amount of energy to pull off at any speed. Where is that energy coming from? Fossil fuels? Solar? Good luck with that. No means of locomotion was mentioned, but we can run comparatives from other known craft. If we compare this feat to a Crew Dragon launched atop a Falcon 9 rocket, let's say Crew 7 from 2 months ago. At 1 minute into launch, when the climber was pulling into Centauri Station, the crew on Dragon are just pushing through max Q, running at only 1,000 kilometers per hour. Dragon doesn't crack 21,000 kilometers per hour until over 8 minutes into launch. So the space elevator in this fictional example would be climbing 21 times faster than the Crew Dragon mission to get to Centauri Station, including spin up and wind down. If the elevator platform takes 15 seconds to reach top speed of 21,000 kilometers per hour from a dead stop, the G-forces on the passengers would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 Gs. Those forces would be the same in reverse when the elevator takes 15 seconds to decelerate. Just FYI, humans are good to about 5 Gs. Sustained exposure to 6 Gs without proper equipment is dangerous. Trained fighter pilots with full-body G-suits can handle 9 to 10 Gs, but only for a couple of seconds before blacking out.
You'll be pulling so hard you'll weigh close to 2,000 pounds. Your skull crushing your spine. Your lungs imploding like an elephant sitting on your chest. You're fighting with everything you have just to keep from blacking out.
Meaning the acceleration in this example would be lethal. It's obvious why Disney has made this ride short. If every person attending the restaurant gets into and out of the room using this simulator, you want the turnover to be as quick as possible. So 1 minute per group seems to be their number of choice. But what would be a more reasonable number? We'll reverse engineer the number here using a 5G max and a 15-second acceleration time, giving the platform a much more reasonable 2,651 kilometers per hour average speed. Only 2.5 times the initial acceleration of the Crew Dragon launch at the 1 minute mark, but now it takes 8 minutes to ascend to Centauri Station compared to 1. Which brings us to the problem we have with the declared elevation of Centauri Station. It would appear to be geostationary, directly above Epcot Center at all times, in L.E.O., which of course doesn't happen. Like the ISS or any other satellite at similar altitude, to avoid falling from the sky it has to be moving at what is called orbital velocity. The lateral velocity required to put a satellite into a state of forever falling towards Earth but not losing altitude. For the ISS at 400 kilometers altitude, that speed is just shy of 30,000 kilometers per hour, the number we're going to use, just under 8 kilometers per second. Compare that to a typical high-velocity bullet fired from a sniper rifle at about 800 meters per second.
Fire in the hole!
And the ISS is moving 10 times that fast. Centauri Station or any other platform of that type at that altitude would also have to move at that speed or it would fall from orbit. In order to get to a geostationary orbit, any satellite has to be moved further away from Earth. Much further. In fact, they are located in the neighborhood of 35,785 kilometers away from Earth, almost 100 times further away than the ISS. That is the only way to keep a satellite in the same position relative to Earth. And we're thinking you'd want to have your tether anchored in the middle of the satellite, not over to the side like they've done here on Centauri Station. But thinking about it logically, if the apex anchor point of the space station, the end counterweight being flung outwards by the planet, is stationary, then the entire concept of a space elevator is pointless, except maybe as a Disney dining experience. See, you're not going to be able to use it for anything useful in space. You can't launch satellites with it. In L.E.O, it is not moving fast enough. Objects in L.E.O have to be moving at orbital velocity. Going back to the view from Centauri Station, see that cute little family enjoying a spacewalk? They would be defying gravity. If they're not moving 30,000 kilometers per hour through the thermosphere, gravity will yank them from orbit and they're going to become flaming meatballs hurtling through the atmosphere. And if you're under the impression they're going to be delivering crew or supplies to the ISS, ask yourself this question. How is the ISS, moving at 30,000 kilometers per hour, supposed to hook up with this stationary platform to transfer goods and personnel? If you were standing at the window of the stationary restaurant watching the ISS coming directly towards you, it would look something like this. Catch that? Here's another view. Good luck parking that in orbit. There's no elevation below GEO where you could just shove a satellite out a hatch where the velocity is enough to keep it in orbit. They would just fall to Earth, like Felix Baumgartner did. Kyrgyzstan put out a video 7 years ago on this topic, and they messed up this part, saying that you only have to get satellites to their orbit elevation, then release them, and that the energy to get the satellite to orbital velocity is provided free of charge due to the rotation of the Earth. Here's the clip.
Compared to rockets, with cargo launched on an elevator, you only need to provide the energy to go up. Fast sideways movement comes free with the Earth's rotation.
The rotation of the Earth is 1,600 kilometers per hour at the equator, and at 400 kilometers altitude, that speed doesn't change too terribly much. The 1,600 kilometers per hour becomes 1,700 kilometers per hour. Nowhere near the 30,000 kilometers per hour required to keep an L.E.O satellite in orbit. In L.E.O elevation, if the satellite is not moving this fast, it's falling, plain and simple. Gravity rules all in these equations, and when you compare the equatorial radius of the Earth, as shown here, to the minuscule L.E.O elevation, it becomes very clear once you zoom in that the little platform here doesn't stand a chance against gravity. But for fun, let's imagine none of these facts matter, pretending the experts at Disney have magically solved the physics behind stationary objects in L.E.O, and they'll be able to launch from the magical kingdom at 28 degrees north. What would be our next hurdle? We've got a ground station connected to a space station by a tether. That's the entire concept of the elevator, sending a capsule up the cable from Earth to orbit for easier access to space. But hold your horses for a minute. It is not possible to build filaments of unlimited length and use them to defeat gravity. For an example of this, we'll go to normal elevators that carry people throughout the tallest skyrises. Elevator cables are typically composite steel, composed of 150 smaller strands or more, and they're not light, so if you hang a long enough elevator cable from a point where the bottom is not touching the floor, gravity pulling along the length of the cable alone will cause the cable to snap under its own weight. This is why, in extremely high buildings, the work required to get you from the ground floor to the top of the building is often divided between multiple systems. The Empire State Building, for example, has 73 elevators to spare visitors from climbing the 1,872 steps to the observation platform. In this cross-section of the Burj Khalifa, you can see how elevators split up the zones of the building. Express elevators in taller buildings often skip over the lower floors to another landing to meet a second car that would complete the work. Now, there have been advances recently that allow elevator cables to reach further than before without snapping, and the tallest interior elevator in the world now is in the Shanghai Tower at 124 floors, reaching 578.5 meters. The Empire State Building recently underwent upgrades to their system to take advantage of new technology. But of course, now they have to pay for their upgrade, so it will cost you $120 to take an elevator to the observation platform next time you're in Manhattan. In comparison, a day pass at Disney World will only run you $109. With the space elevator, the forces on whatever tether they intend to use would include the pulling of the station against it as a counterweight being flung away from the Earth at the far end, with gravity pulling it towards the Earth at the terminal at the same time. We are quite sure that material science has not evolved to the point where they made that leap from 600 meters to 350 kilometers before even considering the counterweight load. Another issue you'll run into with a taut cable strung up through the atmosphere would be the vibrations along the length, including those caused by wind. Anything coming into contact with the cable could cause vibrations in it. Certainly a capsule running up the length of it would cause that as well. Any long filament held taut will have harmonics acting throughout it, and those harmonics would have nodes along the length as well, just like a guitar or piano string. A long, thick string in the lower register of a piano, when struck and allowed to ring, will hit 50 to 60 harmonics and extend out to about 5,000 Hz. These harmonics are also referred to as overtones, where vibrations in the string meet up at various points along the length of the string to create more notes above the note that was struck. The longer the string, the more harmonics it can hit. The first harmonic node pinches the filament in half, producing an overtone 1 perfect octave higher. The next divides the length into thirds, creating a perfect fifth. The next divides the length into 4, creating a perfect fourth and a second perfect octave. The progression continues this way until the string runs out of vibrational energy. There's no telling how many harmonics would resonate through a 350 kilometer long filament if it encounters, for example, air turbulence, like airliners do. Now, what harm can vibrations and harmonics do? Just so happens we have an example of how destructive harmonics and resonance can be. On November 7th of 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was buffeted by 60 km/h winds. Due to the way the 1,816-meter bridge was built and the angle of attack from that particular windstorm, the vibrations caused by the wind hitting the structure were amplified due to resonance, causing the entire deck to oscillate more and more. You can see the waveforms in the deck prior to collapse, and collapse it did. The bridge shook itself apart, and the center span fell into the water below. A 60 km/h wind did that. At 65 to 70 kilometers elevation, zonal winds in the mesosphere can hit 250 kilometers an hour. Add that to a general list of concerns. And on the subject of weather, seems that this system would attract lightning like no other system in the world. Something else to think about, even if we ignore the 400,000 volt potential difference between the ground and the upper level of the atmosphere, as discussed by Richard Feynman. So we covered the space station, the capsule speed, issues with the tether, leaving us with the ground station terminal and anchor. The system connection to the planet will need to be strong enough to resist the centrifugal forces keeping the station in place, using the spin of the Earth to keep the tether tight. What exactly would you attach this system to? It's not like you can just bolt it to the ground or the top of a mountain, so what ground-based anchor is going to be required to secure such a thing? It would have to be a massive structure constructed deep into the crust to be able to withstand the forces, but even then, it comes down to a point of connection, presumably one that can be maintained, between the anchor and the cable. This is a rough diagram of the ground anchor required just for cable terminus of a suspension bridge, and these are the connection points to the cable itself. In the Kyrgyzstan video, they represent an anchor in this frame as being extremely large, buried deep below the earth, but also submerged underwater, which circles back to the ocean floor locations we brought up closer to the beginning. We went through how there are very few countries located right on the equator to facilitate a system like this, and how some people think moving the terminal out to international waters might be a solution here. People don't seem to realize by the time you're out into international waters, you're typically floating atop several kilometers of water depth. Using this Google Earth map of South America, the closest location for North Americans to use a space elevator, you can see the water depth transition from light blue to darker blue, and that line is where the water becomes deeper than 2 kilometers. More of a shelf off the east coast, but then you're into open ocean until you hit Africa moving east, and on the other coast, less of a shelf, and encountering almost nothing but open ocean traveling west until you hit Indonesia. On this view of the equator crossing the Pacific, you can't even see either endpoint, and water depths along the equator crossing the Pacific range down to 6 kilometers depth. At the equator, you're also looking at variations in water depth called tidal bulges, thanks to the moon's gravitational effect on the Earth. So without even considering currents, waveforms, storm conditions, and rogue waves, the sea level at the equator is constantly changing. If anyone suggests building a space elevator ground station at sea in water deeper than about 900 meters, they're not likely talking about having a fixed platform sat on the sea bottom like a compliant tower oil rig. Deeper than 900 meters, deep sea rigs are connected by cable to the sea bottom, which allows the platform to move. And it seems that a moving base connected to an elevator cable connected to a satellite would be less than ideal, as the space station being held in position by magical forces could very well feel every wave that washes against the terminal platform. Also, logistically speaking, platforms at sea are nightmares, busing people to and from the platform for starters, supplying the platform with basics, and energy, including whatever energy the capsule plans on using to send itself skyward. SpaceX appeared to have figured out that challenge when they abandoned their Starship point-to-point oceanic platforms Phobos and Deimos. The former oil rigs were supposed to be converted into marine launch facilities for Starship.
Could you give us an update on the current status of using Phobos and Deimos for Starship operations?
Just last month, we started to. We're going to take one of them and build at least a catch tower on it, and ultimately we will. Ultimately, meaning later this year, build a full launch capability on one of the platforms. So I think hopefully by the end of this year we will have a launch capability at Cape Kennedy at 39A and on one of the ocean platforms as well.
But they were instead quietly sold off in February of 2023. Since the only places along the equator suitable for building a platform attached to the seabed are directly adjacent a landmass, it would make no sense to build at sea and incur all the additional hassle and expense of underwater construction, even though, admittedly, this CGI looks pretty cool. One thing we can say with confidence about people who suggest building things like this at sea is that they have not spent any significant amount of time on the open chuck. The last thing we need to go over is the cable itself, and how it would be a permanent hazard to any satellites in L.E.O. at any elevation below it, as well as air traffic. Again, the concept is the space station at the far end is stationary as a counterweight, but every other satellite in orbit around the planet still has to move 30,000 kilometers per hour to stay in orbit. Any satellite, object, or debris moving at 30,000 kilometers per hour that contacted the filament could damage or potentially sever it, sending the entire system crashing back to Earth. Which takes us to another scenario. There are some rebuttals to this L.E.O. station that include having a much larger counterweight in geostationary orbit, 35,785 kilometers altitude, where the target station itself in L.E.O., the restaurant in this case, is positioned as a node much closer to Earth. This paradigm's 36,000 kilometer cable would now affect every satellite path in higher elevations as well, all the way out to GEO. In fact, some concepts have their apex anchor 100,000 kilometers away from Earth, enough cable to wrap around the Earth twice if the apex anchor were to break loose, and if that cable indeed fell down through MEO and LEO, who knows what else it might take out, even before it crashes to the ground with the restaurant. One other thing of interest is the temperature variations throughout the length of the cable as it experiences extremely cold vacuum of space in the shade and the direct heating from the sun during the day. For example, if the cable was made out of steel, the length of the 350 kilometer long filament encountering the same temperature swing as reported by the ISS from minus 157 C in the shade to 121 C when exposed to the sun would expand to over 1.1 kilometers longer in the sunlight than when it's being shaded by the planet. And if the overall cable out to the apex anchor point is 100,000 kilometers long, that's going to stretch out over 330 kilometers every time it warms up. Meaning something as simple as raw sunshine in space could cause a huge problem for this concept. Now, this has all been in fun, especially considering the video, the one watched by millions of people on Twitter, was actually of a ride attraction at Disney World, but there are actual companies out there trying to convince people this is a viable Earth-to-orbit technology. Every couple of years, there are more articles being written about some startup somewhere thinking they've got it all worked out. And then they disappear and are never heard from again. There's even an organization called the International Space Elevator Consortium, a nonprofit formed in 2007 to provide a unified platform for space elevator advocacy. They host an annual space elevator conference that people apparently go to. This international gathering brings together scientists, engineers, educators, and space enthusiasts from around the globe to share and explore the latest advancements, theories, and ideas related to space elevators. The event covers a variety of topics including engineering challenges, potential materials for construction, such as carbon nanotubes, and the practical, economic, and legal implications of building and operating a space elevator. ISEC also publishes an annual report summarizing the latest developments in space elevator research, advancements in related fields, and updates on ISEC's ongoing activities. Considering it's almost 2024, and they've been around since 2007, and the idea goes back to 1895, one has to wonder what groundbreaking advancements their brain trust has come up with, given their total lack of results. And when you click on their website and watch their webinar, they put themselves firmly in the same level of fantasy as a Musk starship colony on Mars and O'Neill cylinders, so that really sums up their viability in one fell swoop. Like, if you're comparing yourself to those concepts, why not go straight to space hotels with gravity and building orbital rings? They all fall into the same category of science fantasy. Thanks for watching this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic, our first since earning our silver play button for hitting 100,000 subscribers. A huge thank you to all of our patrons and subscribers, new and old, for helping make that happen. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to directly support our channel, you can do so on our page at patreon.com. And before you leave, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and ring that notification bell so that you'll know when The Common Sense Skeptic returns.